Namaskar, Nideshok. In this series, I am going to discuss critical number of fallacies and how they affect understanding the truth. Let's begin with some introduction. In this particular session, I will discuss two fallacies by way of introduction: cherry-picking fallacy and absolutism fallacy or absolutist fallacy. Keep in mind that these fallacies, I don't mean just these two, any given fallacy can have multiple different names. Okay, so we are not going to get stuck into the names as long as we understand the foundation and the principle behind that fallacy. Cherry-picking fallacy and absolutism fallacy. Now, what is the context of the fallacy as a genre in understanding the truth? If we go to Nyaya Darshan, we can see 16 elements that Nyaya Darshan insist. Rishi Gotama, Sage Gotama insists that one must spend time and by luck with the Abhyasa, Upasana, Swadhyaya, and Guru Kripa and Bhagavad Kripa, one may be lucky to become good at these. But Sage Gautam asserts and insists that one must become good at all these 16 elements in order to be good in proper thinking, in proper discernment between multiple claims, between multiple theories, and so on. What are these 16 elements? They are given in the very first sutra of Nyaya Darshan. Pramana, Prameya, Samshaya, Prayojana, Drushtanta, Siddhanta, Avayava, Tarka, Nirnaya, Vada, Jalpa, Vitanda, Hetvabhasa, Chala, Jati, Nigraha, Sthana. These are the 16. And the sutra goes like this: Nigraha Sthananam Tattva Jnana Nishreyasa Adhigama. Adhigamaha. If one becomes expert in these 16 elements, then one can be considered expert in the subject of Nyaya Sutra, Nyaya Darshana, how to think properly, how to put your arguments properly, how to discern between multiple claims, how to eliminate the doubt. Okay, for this purpose, one must be good at these 16. Out of this 16, we are going to focus on one of them, which is what? Hetva Bhasa, which is fallacy, loosely translated as a fallacy. Hetu and then Bhasa. Hetu is a reasoning, Hetu is a theory, okay? The foundation that is used to analyze the evidence with an aim on a specific prameya, specific subject, and specific prayojan, okay? Specific intent. Now, if the reasoning is not properly used, or if somebody does not have a good understanding of these 16 characteristics, 16 elements, and also lack of intellect, that is usually the problem, you know, the mudatva, okay? And Kali Yuga is full of it. But it's easy to blame it on the Kali Yuga. Everyone says because of Kali Yuga this happens, so I'm just quoting it with humor. Whatever may be the cause, but because of lack of study, lack of abhyasa, lack of proper comprehension, or lack of intellect, if it's not properly understood, what it results in is a fallacy. Now, before we get into the subject, it's also important to understand, I mean, we are in the subject, and part of this discussion, it is important to understand to think properly is not easy. It's very difficult. So in some sense, we have to be compassionate. We have to be compassionate towards these individuals who cannot think properly, okay, and quickly jump into hetva bhasa, into fallacies. In fact, these are not some specific individuals. All of us, me included, are guilty of it. So what do we do? Well, therefore we study these 16 elements and we make ourselves familiar with these fallacies. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of fallacies. And in this series, my goal is to discuss, I don't know what the exact number is going to be. I would say possibly 20 to 30 most important, and most important based on what? Most important based on frequently occurring fallacies, I would say. Okay, that you see everywhere. Okay, so I'll just discuss those, but that's not to say there are no additional fallacies. Okay, Hitva Bhasa. What is the definition of Nyaya Darshana definition of a fallacy? Sa Vyabhichara. Actually, it tells you the types of fallacies, by the way. But this combined can actually be a fallacy too. Okay, so it says fallacies of a reason are, now it gives you the types, the broad 5 types. Okay, it says are the erratic, the contradictory, the equal to the question, the unproved, and the mistimed. In Sanskrit Sutra, there, Sa Vyabhichara, that's one kind, you can say, Viruddha, Prakarana Sama, Sadhya Sama, and Kalatita. Now keep in mind, these are 5 broad categories. Not surprisingly, many times when a fallacy occurs, you are going to see many of these aspects become relevant for that single fallacy. Something else. And once we cover these main fallacies, we will start looking at very specific examples. But as we discuss, I will at least provide 1 or 2 examples if time permits. It is not unusual that when a fallacy occurs, actually the fallacy may occur on multiple counts, which is to say multiple different fallacies would be applicable to that fallacious understanding, fallacious comprehension, or rather the lack of comprehension, or therefore a wrong conclusion, okay, or a wrong judgment, wrong discernment. Discernment by definition is like a correct one, but now people do all kinds of nonsensical things. We have to use the word wrong discernment. So multiple fallacies may apply. Now, for a practical purposes, it's important to say which one seems to be the most appropriate, and it's not always easy to make that judgment. Okay, but let's take baby steps, at a time, and let's become familiar with some of the fallacies. As I said, in this section, we are going to look at 2 of them. Okay, the cherry picking fallacy and absolutism fallacy. And I have picked them for a reason, by the way. For example, for the last 30 plus years, I am working predominantly, I work in many areas, but predominantly in the area of dating of the ancient Indian civilizational events, Itihasa, Rigveda, and so on. So Ramayana, Mahabharata, Rigveda, and many others, different epochs or different important individuals or different important grantha and the timing for their original composition or timing for their updates, whether it's a Bhagavad Puran, whether it's a Vishnu Puran, whether it is Surya Siddhanta, on and on. In all of this, what I find is that there are hundreds of players out there. Just take the dating of Mahabharata. Like, I have my Mahabharata book right here. This is American published version. When did the Mahabharata war happen? and more beautiful, but both have the same content, but very nicely published, good quality book by Subbu Publications with the same title, of course, available in India. When did the Mahabharata war happen? I'll tell you what my trolls, detractors, and of course, other Mahabharata researchers do. Okay. Even how naive is this whole exercise of cherry picking fallacy. But let's go through cherry picking fallacy and absolutism fallacy first. What is cherry picking fallacy? I can tell you, if you are looking for examples, all you have to do is pick any claim, any claim, exceptions none, other than 5561 BCE. Okay, but of course, if you want to include 5561 BCE, my claim, and make a case that the claim of 5561 BCE is based on a cherry-picking fallacy, be my guest. I would love to have an open debate with you on camera, uncut, unedited. The important thing is that you have to have your own claim for the year of Mahabharata war. Now, by own claim, you may borrow somebody's claim, that's fine, but you should be convinced about it. And then, of course, we have to do some basic groundwork. If you want to see what minimum groundwork is required, you can go to my WordPress blog site and search for the basic criteria in order to have a debate with Nilay. Okay, what minimum requirement information you must have before you engage with me in discussing a possible debate. So you can include 5561 BC. But if you are looking for an example of cherry picking, I am saying pick any claim, exceptions none, for the year of Mahabharata war. There are 130 plus, pick any other than 5561 BC. But if you think 5561 BC should be included, please go ahead. Ditto for the dating of Ramayana. Now, in case of Ramayana, there are not more than a dozen different claims, but pick any. I would say again, any other than 12,209 BCE, which is what my claim in the book, The Historic Rama, or Subbu Publication has published the same book with the title 12,209 BCE. And you can include that if you think it fits the definition of cherry picking. I would love to have open debate with the same conditions. So there is no dearth of examples. Okay, so that's cherry picking. Now let's understand from a generic perspective what cherry picking is. It applies to all the alternate claims for the year of Ramayana, all the alternate claims for the year of Mahabharata war. But the beauty of understanding this fallacy is not limited to understanding my works or understanding the foolishness that is being generated by number of Mahabharata or Ramayana dating researchers. This is applicable and useful in your everyday life with everything that you do. If you are a researcher, if you're doing any research, if you're reading an article, if you're reading a book, doesn't matter. Like fact checker, as a fact checker, this could be useful. What is a cherry picking fallacy? Well, selective, this is a good example using a metaphor. But cherry picking itself is a metaphor, right? As an analogy. Imagine a cherry tree. And those of you who are familiar with the color of a cherry, especially ripened cherries, like a red color or cherry color. Okay. Imagine what if somebody claims, oh, there are actually, I saw a cherry tree and it has blue cherries. Now, with these days modern genetic science, you can create, all kinds of things, but we are looking at what is generally known. Like, a familiar situation is used as a drishtantam, one of the element in a Nyaya Darshana, okay? Therefore, the cherry picking is used as a metaphor. So cherry picking could have you thinking this is a blue cherry tree. Guess what? If you selectively happen to look at those two blue cherries, Now, do not wonder why they are there. They could be there for thousands of reasons. Some kid went and painted two of them while they are still attached to the tree with a blue color. Okay, thousands of other things might have happened, doesn't matter. But just based on those two cherries, are you going to reach the conclusion that this is a cherry tree with the blue cherries? No, that would be a fallacy. Okay, but what does the full body of evidence tells you? Well, you should look at rest of the evidence. So it's okay if you happen to look at two cherries and they were blue in color to think that, oh, maybe I never heard about the blue cherries or blue cherry tree. Who knows? What would you do next? Maybe look at the same tree and see if there are more blue cherries. Okay. And still there may be a curiosity as to say, all that I'm aware of, assuming you are aware of, are like a cherry with a red color. What happened here? So that's a samshay. That is also one of the element of a nyaya darshan. So you just look at something and just start running thinking that's the truth is not allowed. Okay. It's not a characteristic of an intelligent person. It's not a characteristic of a thoughtful person. But you will find my trolls are good examples. You'll find that's exactly what they do. In fact, something very funny they do is like this. In all my three books, and I may not have my third book here, I always write a chapter called the what is it? The conflicting evidence. Okay. So I have that in this book. Let me find it out for you. Let's see, the conflicting evidence. I make a point, yeah, there. So in the historic Ram book, it's chapter, I don't know if you can see it. Okay, it's chapter 17, conflicting observations. That's what I've written. If you look at the Mahabharat book, I think it's chapter 9. Okay, chapter 9, conflicting observations. And Bhishma Nirvan, my third book, you will again find a chapter on conflicting evidence, conflicting observations. My trolls, what they have done is they take these, they're so lazy, they will take this chapter on conflicting observations and start discussing each observation and telling people, look, this observation from Mahabharata or Ramayana that exists in Mahabharata or Ramayana, and that does not agree for the date that Nileshok is claiming, which is namely 5561 BCE for Mahabharata, 12,209 BCE for Ramayana. Guess what? I have already said that. Just imagine the laziness on their part. That's what they will take. Okay. On the other hand, what is interesting is, as I said, if you want to see a good example of cherry picking fallacy, select any of the claims, exceptions none, for the year of Mahabharat war or the year of Ram Ravan Yuddha, the dating of Ramayana, dating of Mahabharat, exceptions none. Of course, 5561 BC and 12,209 BC are exception, but that's my claim. So if you want to include, fine. And study them. You will find each and every one of them, except this exception, are basically based on a cherry-picking fallacy. What they have done is, and some of them even don't touch the Mahabharata text or Valmiki Ramayana text. Okay, that's a joke of another kind. But even those who do, they look at a couple of pieces of evidence, just like those two blue cherries. Okay, and why do they pick that? That's another long subject. It's very difficult for me to even discuss that nonsense. Many times they have a date, okay, a potential hypothetical date for the year of Mahabharata or Ramayana in their mind based on somebody else's date that they are randomly borrowing, okay? They are borrowing without giving a credit to that previous individual. And now all that they're doing is looking for some evidence which may provide the support. That is that cherry picking. If you search for it in a big text like Mahabharata or Valmiki Ramayana or any other text, very likely, more likely, by luck, you will get some. And you can twist and torture, which is what they do, and claim, therefore it matches. But what about rest of the evidence? Okay, so how do you, if you understand this cherry picking fallacy, how do you fight it or how do you work against it? This is how you do. This is what you do. How do you respond to cherry picking? Okay, expose the fallacious reasoning. Point out the fact that your opponent is ignoring crucial information which should be taken into account and explain why this is a problem. For example, if somebody looks at Mahabharata, and again, we will do a detailed session once we understand these fallacies and point out the fallacies. Okay, but if you take, say, Mahabharata, and somebody uses certain evidence and says, oh, therefore, this is the year of Mahabharata war. And we say, oh, did you take into account the Arundhati Vasishta observation? Because it says Mahabharata war is not possible anytime after 4636 BCE. What is your year? Is it after 4636 BCE? Is it in the last 6,500 years? Then Arundhati Vasishta observation falsifies it. Bhishma Nirvana evidence also falsifies it. 50 plus planetary descriptions also falsifies it. So Bhishma Nirvana evidence is what? About 100 pieces of observations. Planetary evidence is 50 plus. Arundhati Vasishta is 1. So 150 plus pieces of evidence from the Mahabharata text decisively falsifies any claim that is after 4636 BC. Any claim in the last 6,500 years. So that's how you would respond to it. Bring omitted information into consideration, which is what I did. I asked, hey, did you look at AV observation? Did you look at the all planetary evidence? And not some planetary evidence, because that will be cherry picking. Not some evidence about Bhishma Nirvana, all the evidence about Bhishma Nirvana, all the evidence related to Bhishma Nirvana duration. Because if you don't take all the evidence, then you are cherry picking. Okay, so that's what you do. There is another one principle of total evidence, which is saying the same thing. Also goes by the name Bernoulli's maxim. Okay, I'll skip that. Basically, I covered the point in the top one. Now let's look at the second fallacy, absolutism fallacy or absolutist fallacy, and they kind of go hand in hand. And therefore, I thought I will discuss these two together. Okay, because cherry picking is a one corner, this is the other one. But look at the funny side of it. Okay, now what happens? If you are not doing cherry picking, then what are you doing? Basically, you are looking at, once you define your theory, you are taking into account all the evidence. Okay, all the evidence demanded by the theory. If you take Mahabharata text and the astronomy evidence inside it, then that amounts to 300 plus pieces of evidence. If you take Valmiki Ramayana and again take the astronomy evidence as your theory, then it amounts to close to 600 pieces of specific evidence. So the demand is that you take all of this evidence into account, you test each and every piece of evidence. Sometimes you have to test it individually, like AV observation. Sometimes you have to test it in a group together, like Bhishma Nirvana evidence. Sometimes it's a combination of the two, like planetary evidence. And that's how actually you reach 5561 BC for the Mahabharata war or 12,209 BC for Ram-Ravan Yuddha. Now, when somebody does that, now people will ask me. So when they ask a question, they create this absolutism fallacy. Let's understand the absolutism fallacy first, and then I'll give you an example. What is absolutism fallacy? Okay, absolutism arises when we make no exceptions for rules that have exceptions. So a question that I will typically get in the context of Mahabharata is like this. Okay, so Nilesh, I hear you that you are claiming, no, I am asserting, but same thing. 300 plus pieces of evidence, astronomy evidence from the Mahabharata text. And then you say you put them together in the fashion of a jigsaw, as if solving a jigsaw puzzle, as if solving a crossword puzzle, a combination thereof, and you arrive at 5561 BC. Let me ask you a question, they will say. Now, can you say that all of those 300 plus pieces of evidence that you assert, you claim, they all fit and point to 5561 BC? Are there not any exceptions? And the same question can be repeated for the dating of Ramayana, which close to 600 pieces of evidence. And do they all point to 12,209 BC? And are there not some pieces of evidence that do not fit or do not lead one to 12,209 BC? Okay. Now, the question is very reasonable. Question is very valid. Actually, it's a wonderful question. And my answer is, of course, depending on if I know the person and know the intellect of that person, then I have to adjust my answer to match the person's comprehension ability. But not knowing that, what could be the answer? The answer is that, well, majority of the evidence, whether it's a Mahabharata or Ramayana, 300 plus or close to 600, points to 5561 BC for Mahabharata or 12,209 BC for Ram Ravan Yuddha. But is there some evidence? Are there some pieces of evidence in either of the text which do not lead to 5561 BC or 12,209 BC? The answer is yes, there is. That is actually compiled into those chapters I call conflicting observations, because that evidence do not point to 5561 BC or 12,209 BC. Now the absolutism fallacy comes in picture. Now, the absolutism fallacy, remember, it's a fallacy. It's a wrong way of thinking. It demands that there cannot be any exception. And this is what that definition is. Absolutism arises when we make no exceptions for rules that have exceptions. Actually, I have listed that evidence under conflicting observation. And somebody says, actually, many have said it in the last 12 years. Okay, they say, okay, so Nileshji, now see, so there is some evidence which do not agree with 5561 BCE from the Mahabharata text for the year of Mahabharata war. And there is some evidence in the Valmiki Ramayana that does not agree or does not lead to the conclusion of 12,209 BCE. Now, doesn't that mean your date is wrong? This is based on the absolutism fallacy. Okay, just as a description, we are saying absolutism fallacy arises when we make no exceptions for the rules that have exceptions. Now, the question is why there could be some evidence in the Mahabharata text or a Ramayana text, or for that matter, any text, any source material, okay, that may not agree with the rest of the evidence pointing to a specific date. Like in this case, we are talking dating, so we are talking date. It can be anything else. Why that may happen? Ask that question, just like that blue cherry tree, ask the question, why am I seeing blue cherries? If I look at more cherries, do I find red cherries or again more blue cherries? This can happen. Anyone who has studied our text well or the world text well, anyone who has even a decent experience with the research knows that there are always exceptions. Always exceptions. In the data, those people who are familiar with the data analytics, we will say, what is that? An outlier. And then we investigate the outlier data and we say, oh, okay, well, there was some mistake that was done when we performed the experiment. Okay, we can put it aside. Sometimes we don't know what went wrong. We say, okay, let's put it aside. Let's investigate what might have gone wrong. Something similar when it comes to our grantha. What is it? All kinds of things have happened. Pathved is one. Okay, so we see variations between different manuscripts of the same grantha. Okay, some particular shlok is not there in one version, it is there in another manuscript, and so on. Both multiple manuscripts may have the same shlok, but there are variations. Okay, then some people have inserted the stuff with what we call interpolations. So all of this could be the reason. And now the next question is, how are we going to find out what is interpolation and what are we going to do with it? Finding a Pathaved is easy, or when a certain shlok exists in this one manuscript but does not exist in another manuscript, what are we going to do? Are we going to take away that shlok from a discussion as a evidence, or we are going to include it? I mean, we have to decide the rules for it. But these are the reasons why there can be exceptions in case of Mahabharata text or Ramayana text. But let me tell you a couple of practical examples of this. Imagine a tennis match. Okay, so again, we are taking this as a metaphor, as a simile, as a analogy. Okay, because something that's familiar to everyone. If you don't understand tennis, tough luck. Either you can ignore this portion, or you can learn about tennis and come back and listen to it. Just skip and go to the next one. Find alternate means to know what you need to know, assuming you are curious, assuming you have a jitnyasa. If you don't have a jitnyasa, you should not be here. This is not for lazy folks at all, okay? So let's look at the tennis as a metaphor. Take scenario number one. A very idealistic scenario, but it happens in real practice too, okay? Two players, let's call the player on the left side as player A, the winner, okay? And this player B as the loser in this particular case, okay? He lost the match. Player A won the match, A versus B. And what was the score? Best of 5. And the score was 6-0, 6-0, 6-0. We may call this clean sweep. And even then, those who understand tennis know that even in a match like this, we don't have the details, but a very likely scenario, especially these two players are considered good players in their own right, we would say, oh, wow, well, very clean sweep, But still, of course, somebody who understands tennis would know very likely player B, who lost the match, might have, very likely would have scored some points against player A, but they're still not visible here. And if we go down into each set and look at each of the 6 games that were played, so total of 12 games that were played, we will able to actually find that player B did score against player A. But still, you will say, wow, congratulations, player A. What a clean sweep. We will say that in spite of the fact that player B has indeed scored few points against player A. It would be an absolutist or absolutism fallacy here to say that, you know what, if you want to declare player A as a winner, then there should not be any point scored by player B against A. If you make an argument like that, then you are getting into absolutism fallacy. Let's look at second scenario, for example, which is same, but I'm saying and more, which is what I just described. Like you may go into more details and find out, if you go to the level of a game, that actually player B has scored some points, but that doesn't change the outcome. Let's look at the scenario 3. In this case, it so happened, tough match, and both of them, first set was won by A, second was by B, third one was by A. Alternate sets they won. Last set, it went to the 5th set, and player A won that set and therefore won the match. So what is the conclusion? Yeah, player A won the match. How was the match? Oh, it was a great match. A great, tough match. And still we are going to say player A was the winner. Now bring this logic to claims for the year of Mahabharata war or Ramayana. Actually, the scenario there is like what? 6-0, 6-0, 6-0. Don't take my word. Read these books. read the books or whatever the other people have written, when they claim a year, and reach your own conclusion. But the point is, even if it was something like scenario 3, still player A is the winner. Now you might say, well, actually, you know what? If this had happened and that would have happened, guess what? Player B might have won and so on. And the discussion can go on. The point is, player A is the winner. Now, if there is some doubt and if the both players agree, what can we do? We say, let's do another match. So here definitely player A is a winner, but let's do another match. And another match, and another match, assuming they are willing, assuming they have energy, assuming people have a time to watch. This, what would be equivalent of that when it comes to a research such as the dating of Mahabharata, Ramayana? The equivalent of that would be, okay, so astronomy has been exhausted, astronomy evidence has been exhausted. That goes to 5561 BCE or 12,209 BCE, like a 606060 606060606060. And sometime we will do that, by the way. We can look at the set like Arundhati Vasishta, 10 goes to 5561 BC. Bhishma evidence is like what, 100 plus pieces of evidence. Out of that, maybe there are 2, and I'm going to show you some example, 2 that may go against 5561 BC, at least prima facie, but 98 are in favor of 5561 BC. So 98 to 2. Okay, that game set, whatever you want to call it, goes to 5561 BC. And then planetary evidence, 50. And guess what? 50 to 0. Okay, all goes to 5561 BC. And then Saraswati evidence. And then oceanography evidence, then climatology evidence, then seismology evidence, then sedimentology evidence, then physical anthropology evidence, then genetic evidence, on and on and on. And we can treat this each different field of science as if it's a set, look at all the evidence there, compare it with the descriptions in the Mahabharata text or Ramayana text, and decide who wins, and goes on and on. Okay, that's how we can do the comparison. Okay, let's look at another one, the cricket. Again, just for simplicity, let's imagine one day cricket, 50 overs each. It doesn't matter whether you call it 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 or 50, doesn't matter. 2 teams, A and B, or 1 and 2. A absolutism fallacy would demand something as ridiculous as this. For example, a scenario they would demand, I'm just giving one example. So team A scores some good runs. I put a number, 300 runs. And no loss of wicket. They'll demand, okay, if there's a loss of wicket, guys, you lost. No, that's not true if you understand cricket. But an absolutism fallacy would demand something like this. Okay. And if they want to truly declare team A as a winner and B as a loser, they would also demand that B should not have made any runs and they lost all wickets. Now, those of you who understand cricket, you will laugh at this and you will find this ridiculous. The reason I'm mentioning it is a absolutism fallacy, even when it would not sound as ridiculous as this, is actually this much ridiculous. Okay, he says, oh, so you got one observation that does not match 5561 BC, so then yours is wrong, isn't it? No, it is not. What you are falling into is an absolutism or absolutist fallacy. There could be many reasons why that one observation may not match for 5561 BC, or in case of Ramayana, 12,209 BC. All right. Now, so that's it, guys. Now, how do we avoid absolutism fallacy? Okay. 1, identify the exceptions for any rule. So in our case, in case of Mahabharata Ramayana, what can we say? We say, there are Pathabhed. And depending on which of the reading you take into account, it may lead to different conclusion. We also understand that in principle, there can be interpolations, which means we have to define or decide or establish a criteria to deal with Pathabhed. We have to establish a criteria to deal with interpolation. Like, how are we going to identify interpolation? And what are we going to do when there are alternate readings like a Pathabhed? This criteria should be define a priori before we get into the discussion of the evidence and the objective testing of this evidence and so on. This is not limited to any particular kind of evidence, like any particular discipline of science. It applies to anything and everything. So identify the exceptions for any rule that you make. Also, be patient when exploring complex issues. Dating of Mahabharata, dating of Ramayana, dating of Rigveda is not easy. It's extremely complex. But if you are patient, that's what it says, be patient when exploring complex issue. Don't just jump and start discussing which date is correct. Okay, we say, what should be the criteria? What's the basis? What are some of the things, some of the preparation, a priori preparation one must do for an apples to apples comparison between the claims and so on. So that's required. Third, do not jump to simplistic answers, such as, oh, you got this one particular evidence and that does not match. Okay, how about your evidence for, what is that? The famous, my God, what's the I'll get it. Balram Tirtha Yatra. Okay, the Mahabharata statement says Balram left on Pusha and after 42 days arrived on Shravana. Okay, and that needs to be the last day of the war, 18th day of the war. Okay, now that particular observation, for example, as is, if taken as a prima facie, does not match for 5561 BC. And a very immature, naive Mahabharata researchers themselves and their follower trolls, okay, over enthusiastic trolls, they start saying, okay, but the Balrama Tirthatra doesn't match, so therefore 5561 is wrong. Now, what is the problem with this? Keep in mind, this is an absolutism fallacy, but do you see the flavor of it, of a cherry picking nonsense? Okay, so this evidence does not match. That's a fact. Put it on the side. Who other Mahabharata researcher? The answer is no one. Okay, but who other Mahabharata researcher has ever bothered to make a list of evidence, or Ramayana researcher who has bothered to make a list of evidence, that evidence from the Valmiki Ramayana text or from the Vyasa's Mahabharata text that does not agree with whatever they are claiming? No other Mahabharata researcher will dare do this. Do you know why? Because the list would be so long. Okay, their cherry picking fallacy, how they arrived at their date, will be for everyone to see. So they don't want to do it. And their followers are also in a happy world. And most of our Hindu folks, the Indian folks, including Indian researchers, either they have no guts to talk in open against this blatant fraud, or they themselves are involved in this fraudulent business. So they don't say anything. Because if they open their mouth here, somebody else will talk about their research in the same fashion. So they want this business to continue. Bottom line, do not jump to simplistic answers. Now, an exercise that you can take beyond this particular video, just think for yourself, create or find examples of absolutist fallacies. Like, do you get into this yourself? When you hear something, when you hear about the evidence and you question it. Okay, but that one data point doesn't agree with your thing, or somebody saying, looking at a regression and saying, well, but all the data points is not falling on that line. No, then there is no need for a regression if everything falls on the same line, so to say. Okay, that's like not understanding how the world works, how the modeling works, and so on. The other exercise that you may also consider is think, what could be the reason, what could be the rationale? Why are we drawn to absolutist thinking? This is also to be thought for, why are we drawn to cherry picking business? Okay, why are we drawn to cherry picking fallacy? I mean, it's worth thinking, guys, when I'm telling you 99.99%, other than 5561 BCE, not even a single exception, everyone has arrived at their claim based on a cherry picking fallacy. Now, this is not ordinary claim that I'm making, guys. Okay, Go and look at any and show me that there is an exception and I'm not right. It's my open challenge to you. Every single alternate claim for the year of Mahabharata war, ditto for the Ramayana, is based on a cherry-picking fallacy. And not limited to astronomy evidence. Take any evidence is based on a cherry-picking fallacy. Of course, there are additional fallacies, and therefore we are going to look at possibly 20, 30 different key fallacies in this series. Okay. But as a food for thought, think of these two pieces there, on the exercise. Create or find examples of the absolutist fallacies, also cherry-picking fallacies. And also think, why are we drawn to absolutist fallacies, absolutist thinking, but also cherry-picking fallacy, cherry-picking thinking. All right. Now, quickly, I want to talk about the truthlikeness score. So when somebody shows the evidence, if somebody makes a claim, like so and so year is the year of Mahabharata war or of Ramayana, and if you are intelligent enough, you will say, based on what? Based on what evidence? And the cherry-picking expert will say, well, here is the evidence. Look, the Saturn needs to be here, and look, for my year, the Saturn is here. The Balarama needs to live on the Pusha, and after 42 days, on the last day of the war, he must arrive on the Shravana. Look, my last day of the war is here, and the nakshatra is a Shravan. Bingo. And if I go back 42 days, there is a Pushya nakshatra and 42 days. So Balarama, just based on this Balarama, I can say my year is right. And you have to say, oh, great, thank you. And you say, oh, wow, that's phenomenal. Nileshji, what are your thoughts? No, I don't have a thoughts for fools and morons. You should ask, okay, what do you have any additional evidence? Does Mahabharata text has additional evidence? And does it also point to your date? How did you arrive at your date? Is it just based on this Balarama evidence? So, for example, therefore, we have to look at all the evidence. And how do we compare this when we also accept the fact that not all the evidence will point to a specific claim? The answer, just like we deal with two players playing tennis with some rules and regulations, best of 5, we might say. And then there is a rules, like how many games they have to play before one set is complete. And when they have to exchange the sides on the court, there are some rules, right? If they get into deuce, like, how that is basically scored, so that who won that game. There's a rules and logic to it. Similarly, in science or in general, but let's stick to science, jnana, vijnana, we have a score like this called truth-likeness score or verisimilitude score. How does that work? It works exactly like a tennis match. Okay. For example, remember, we have to take all the evidence into account. So let's look at this decisive dating combo. Okay. 4 wonderful books. 3 of them belongs to mine. I feel good. The one by another great researcher, okay, Jivan Rao Yugantha. So I'm looking at all those 4. And a very crude way, the last way, I have to get back to Jivan and ask him what would be that exact score. But I'll tell you how I arrived at that score, okay? So the first one, the Mahabharata war, 5561 BCE. 300 plus pieces of astronomy evidence. All of them, now watch my language carefully, practically all of them point to 5561 BC and only 5561 BC. Arundhati Vasishta gives you a bracket. Bhishma Nirvana evidence gives you a bracket, which is inside the Arundhati Vasishta bracket. And then if you just use planetary evidence 50 plus, now you don't need 50 plus, but the point is, the demand is that you use all the evidence. Okay, so when 50 plus evidence of planetary descriptions are used, they all point to 5561 BC. Now the question, is there any evidence that does not lead to or match with 5561 BC? Yes, about 10 pieces of evidence out of 300 plus pieces of evidence. They do not, okay, prima facie, directly at the first look, with a simple analysis, just like a Balaram Tirtha Yatra. So Balaram Tirtha Yatra, right there, you can call this as a 1 piece of evidence, or you can call it 3 pieces of evidence, 42 days, last day nakshatra is a Shravan and the first day nakshatra is a Pushya. Or you can call this one piece of evidence saying must begin on Pushya, end on Shravan, and 42 days. Whichever you want to do, it doesn't matter. But once you define a specific definition, that definition must be consistent in looking at rest of the evidence. Okay, that's the point. So depending on whether you measure this as a 3 pieces of evidence or whether you take this as a 1, that number 10 will change. It may turn to 7, it may turn to 10, depending on that. So that goes only 10 pieces of evidence, it goes against it. And the absolutist or absolutism fallacy would say, oh, well, you got 10 going wrong. How can you trust 5561 BC? Doesn't that mean 5561 BC is wrong? Well, if you use that, then if you use this principle, then not principle, if you use this fallacy, absolutism fallacy, then guess what? Einstein is wrong, Newton is wrong, Kepler is wrong, Copernicus is wrong, Galileo is wrong, Faraday is wrong, Maxwell is wrong, everyone is wrong. That's the reason the absolutism fallacy is something not applicable, not useful, therefore it is a fallacy. What about Ram Ravan Yuddha happening in 12,209 BC? Close to 600 pieces of evidence, astronomy evidence. Majority of it matches for 12,209 BC. There are some. Is there some that does not lead to 12,209 BC? Yes, about 22. Oh, doesn't that mean 12,209 BC is wrong? No, you are jumping into absolutism fallacy. Let's go to the Bhishma Nirvana. Okay, now I have put their number 400 plus. Why is that? In dating 5561 BC, I looked at 300 plus evidence. When I wrote Bhishma Nirvana, I looked at additional 100 plus pieces of evidence from the Mahabharata text in the context of Bhishma Nirvana and Bhishma Nirvana duration and the details of Bhishma Nirvana, the events in the life of Bhishma from the first day of the war all the way to the day of Bhishma Nirvana. So there is an additional 100 plus pieces of evidence descriptions that I have not taken into account when I wrote my first book, When Did the Mahabharata War Happen? So if you add to that, guess what? Therefore, that 10 will also follow. Okay, the 10 pieces that did not agree with 5561 BC, but there were 2 additional ones. And actually, after I wrote that, I realized that there are no 2 additional ones. Those 2 are actually included in the 10, but once I had prepared the slide, I just left it like that. So, okay, so 400 plus evidence pointing to 31st January 5560 BC as the day of Bhishma Nirvana. There are about 10, or in my error, I'll accept the error, 12 pieces of evidence going against it. Again, if you say, oh, but there is some evidence goes that does not agree with 31st Jan 5560 BC, therefore it's wrong. No, then you are getting into absolutism fallacy. By that fallacy criteria, nothing in the world is right. Nothing. Remember the criteria I showed for winning a tennis match or winning a cricket match using the absolutism fallacy. Okay, it's not acceptable, and for good reasons. Quickly, the last one, the Yuganta. First day of Kali Yuga, 2nd November 5561 BC, the 18th day of the Mahabharata war. And so what I did is the Mahabharata war 5561 BC, the first book, When Did the Mahabharata War Happen, had 300 plus pieces of evidence. Bhishma Nirvana added 100 plus pieces of additional evidence descriptions. And what Jivan Rao did is he looked at, again from the Mahabharata text, close to 100 plus pieces of evidence related to the Yuga. Yuga beginning, Yuga Sandhya, end of a Yuga, so on and so forth. Okay, so I added to that. That's what that is my logic. So 500 plus. And how did I arrive at 28? So that's like what, 12? If I do add, that's 12 plus 10, 22, and what, 6? So 16 data points. Not knowing exact number, I just, because I have read the book, and actually I do have the book right here, the Amazon version, not the Subbu publication version. And so I quickly went through some of the chapters to look at some of the evidence that he finds from Mahabharata, but actually even outside Mahabharata, that tends to go against. Okay, I mean that not against, that will not agree with the either the last day of the Mahabharata war as the day of beginning of a Kali Yuga, or whatever, I mean, some other erratic explanation. So I added up, and quickly what I could count, that added to about 16. So I added that 16 to 12, and that's how I wrote down 28. But just like you will look at a tennis match or a cricket match, and you say, okay, if one party has run 300 plus runs and the other party has only done 10, so you can do 300 minus 10 to figure that out, or 575 minus 22 to figure out how much evidence is in favor of 12,209, ditto for 400 minus 12 and 500 minus 28. You know, the left side is winning by a decisive margin, no ifs and no buts. That's it, guys. Okay, we'll stop. So we looked at two fallacies, cherry picking fallacy and absolutism fallacy. I discussed these two together because in some ways they are related to each other. Okay, they're kind of come from the extreme ends. And the funny thing is, so do think why we think in a cherry picking construct. Okay, because many fools use just the cherry picking evidence to arrive at the conclusion. And funny enough, they will use the same logic to take a well-established theory, well-established claim, and say why that may not be correct. Okay, in both cases, although the fallacies are different, absolutism fallacy and cherry picking fallacy, in both cases, it is the cherry picking thinking. Okay, and what is a disaster? What a disaster it is, because in one place, the person was happy, somebody just using a cherry picked evidence to arrive at a conclusion. And at other times, somebody picked the cherries oneself and said, therefore, a claim that is based on enormous, well-established, empirical, tested evidence is still wrong. Okay, so something is wrong, not with there, something is wrong in the head, in the logic, in the intellect of the people who easily, quickly fall for these fallacies. All right, namaskar.